Is expert thumbs there. Hi, everyone. How are you? It is so nice to see you all today. My name is Allison Elsner, and I'm the CEO of the San Bernardino County Medical Society. And I apologize, I'm trying to fight off my kitty cat from getting in the middle of the screen here. We are very excited to be presenting this webinar in partnership with our business partner, which is now called our Supporter of Medicine. We are switching over the name of our partners to Supporters of Medicine because that much more accurately reflects what they do for all of you, our physician and partnerships. So UnisLink is here today to talk about credentialing essentials to protect revenue and streamline provider and health plan enrollment. And this is something that is so critical to all of you as you try to reduce your administrative burden and improve the workflows and ultimately patient outcomes in your own offices. So we are excited to learn a lot today from our guest presenters. I'm going to introduce them now. James Muir is a 30-year revenue cycle expert who has led revenue cycle teams for Conifer, NextGen Healthcare, AVAAP, and many others. James is a highly respected growth leader, best-selling author, speaker, and seasoned revenue cycle expert, specializing in leveraging process and technology to improve financial performance for clients and personal value for their stakeholders. He's done extensive work for some of the largest names in technology and healthcare, including HCA, Tenet, Catholic Healthcare, Banner, Dell, IBM, and others. Throughout his career, James has focused on helping leaders in healthcare think through and overcome their biggest business challenges and to reach their personal goals. So first off, welcome, James. Great to see you. We are also excited to welcome Tennille Mail, who is UnisLink's Director of Credentialing Services. With over 17 years of experience, she's a leading expert in provider enrollment and compliance. Tennille is a master at streamlining credentialing workflows to reduce turnaround times and minimize administrative burden. Her proactive approach ensures a seamless revenue cycle, helping to prevent payment delays and enhance reimbursement readiness. So with that, we're going to welcome James and Tennille. And just a quick reminder that we are going to be taking your questions in the chat. Feel free to ask them as we go along, and James and Tennille may just go ahead and address them throughout the course of their presentation. And if not, we will get to them when the presentation is over. So James and Tennille, take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Allison. It's great to be with you guys. We really enjoy these opportunities to share what we find exciting about credentialing, and you have our promise that before you're done here, that you'll be excited about the possibilities too. So let's jump in, and no need to introduce ourselves here because of that wonderful introduction that you did. But I am very excited to be doing this session with my close friend and longtime credentialing expert, Tennille Mail. So what that means is that we're going to be able to draw on all this experience that she has and is in her head as we go through all the content. So, and like Allison said, we'll keep an eye on the chat. So if you got a question throughout, just let us know. We're going to be interacting with each other, so we'll be able to see it, and we can try to incorporate the answer to your question right as you go. So with that said, Tennille, thank you for joining me today. You make my life super easy, so I appreciate you joining us.
So it's my pleasure, James. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Allison, for having us today.
All right, well, so here's what we're going to cover. We're going to spend a minute on current industry challenges and trends when it comes to credentialing. We'll talk about what we're going to accomplish during this session together. We'll spend a minute on the need for credentialing and the implications of getting that wrong. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between credentialing versus enrollment versus privileging. All those things are sometimes used interchangeably. We'll get some definitions around those. And then we'll talk about the various different forms of credentialing. And then we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about automation, how to avoid delays, and basically best practices around credentialing. And when we conclude, we'll share a way that you can get some help if you need. So if that sounds pretty good, let us jump in. And I don't know about you guys, but whenever I join one of these webinars, I really like to get, just some kind of data or metrics that are kind of hard to find. I'm hoping that the presenters have, done a little homework for me. And so we wanted to deliver that for you early. So here's some facts and some trends around credentialing that I think you'll find interesting, maybe even a little bit shocking. But the first is that the average credentialing process for a single provider, and I'm going to ask you about this right now, right? Takes between 90 and 100 days. Now, that's what the industry is saying. I want you to tell me, even though it's a little early, what is it really? What are you seeing right now, like up to the minute?
Yes, right now, current times for processing windows with the payers is approximately 90 days for the federal payers. So your Medicare, Medicaid, you can get those in within that time frame. But for the commercial payers, especially your big ones, the United Healthcares, Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they are superseding that 120-day time frame. And a lot of those payers are not willing to backdate their effective dates. So timelines and processing timeframes are tremendous right now, especially for those large commercial payers.
Okay, I'm sure I'll get a chance to ask you this again, but can you tell me who the who are the worst offenders at long credentialing periods?
It's absolutely Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is everybody's top contender, right? They are notoriously the worst for processing timeframes, unfortunately. They are
So,
180 plus days.
oh,
All,
okay.
yep.
All right. Well, you answered my question there. So there you go. So I would say 90 to 120 is being very kind here. I think
It
if you
is.
include commercial payers, it could go out as far as 180 days. Um,
Yes.
Now, each individual application, according to the statistics, is taking between 12 and 20 hours per payer to complete. Do you agree with this? Is that approximately right in that range? How long it takes to do an application?
So, I mean, the actual completion of the application from an identified like staff member is nowhere near that time frame, right? It only takes you 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the length of the application. But from start to finish processing time frame, from the time you submit the application, document your submission efforts, do the follow-up, perform to make sure that they have received the application, perform routine follow-ups in regards to that application processing, you are looking at 12 to 20 hours per provider, per payer, all day, every day. A lot of times those timelines are superseding as well, based on the payer's hold times, based on the payer's processing timeframes. Because if we're following up every 2 weeks, as you should, then if you're going into the 180-day mark, you're really going to start racking up the hours easily.
Yeah. All right. Well, delays in credentialing create opportunity cost, and that's because we can't see patients until the credentialing is completed. That opportunity cost is ranging between 2 and 3 grand per provider per day, depending on the specialty. And so they estimate that annual losses due to credentialing can be as high as like 60 to 100 grand per year per provider. So it's a pretty big deal not to get your credentialing done and turned around in a quick manner. Then we got the operational side of this whole thing, which is, each provider maintains, and you and I laughed about this last time we were looking at the industry stats, between 19 and 30 credentialing relationships. Now, before I'm going to tell you, because we have a lot of clients in California area where they have a lot of IPAs, but are you buying into this 19 to 30 particular credentialing relationships, or is it higher than this?
Well, I mean, it's extremely common for the providers to be enrolled and required to maintain relationship with at least 19 major payers, James. But then when you calculate in all the additional lines of businesses, the networks, the supplemental plans, the payers list can become quite extensive and usually ends up tripling the work that's required to maintain those enrollments effectively. So that's a good average for the major plans, but once you start talking the additional lines of business and networks, it really grows fast.
Yeah. Well, what I can tell you is because of all the IPAs in California, we have one organization we work with that has over 100 plans per provider, over 100.
Mhm.
So that's mind blowing, right?
Yes.
Statistically, I think 85% of all credentialing applications have errors in them or missing information. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about this later in the presentation, but is that your experience or is that experience when people are trying to do it on their own?
A lot of times it's a variance, right? So regarding that 85% statistic related to errors on the applications and missing information causing delays, this almost seems to be like the new tactic the payers are hoping will allow them the reason to reject or deny the enrollment request. It can be from the simplest errors, such as abbreviations of names or practice locations. For example, if the provider's medical license has the provider's middle name listed, and then on the application it's abbreviated, this can trigger a rejected application. The same for a practice location. If the W-9 or the IRS letter shows the word street, but on the application it's abbreviated as ST, this can trigger a rejection. If current documents are not submitted with the application, this will absolutely result in a denial or rejection from the payer, even if the document was current when you submitted the enrollment request, such as a medical license or a DEA or even the certificate of insurance. But if it is set to expire during the middle of the processing timeframe, then the expectation is that the updated document is sent to the payer for continued processing. And as we know, the payers can take many months to process any enrollment request. So the documentation that was originally sent for the initial submission may not be current by the time it actually crosses the credentialing representative's desk to review. So these statistics are not surprising. It can be errors from the actual person that's completing the application, but most often these rejections and denial reasons are just tactics that the payers are using these days.
Incredible that they don't want to have more providers serving their patients. That's their job.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I think the most depressing statistic, and you can comment on this one since you're in charge of a whole army of people that do credentialing, is that the credentialing agent turnover rates statistically are like right in the top 5% of all roles in healthcare. In 2024, it was an amazing 51%, which means every year you're going to lose half your staff. So your comment on that? Are you seeing that kind of, maybe nobody likes to be a credentialist? Tell me what you think.
Yeah, definitely, James. I mean, I'm disheartened to say that this is not a surprising figure to see. From the payers end, this is one of the reasons that almost all payers have discontinued their dedicated provider representatives, which used to be in place for each and every payer to handle those specific enrollment accounts. But due to the demand placed on the remaining team to ensure all those enrollments are completed and the workloads are becoming larger and larger, it's becoming a less sought after position. The staff members that are in those positions for the right reasons to actually ensure providers are enrolled for proper reimbursement and for patients to be able to be scheduled and know their practitioners in network with their insurances are not the ones that are working for the payers, because the network systems are actually designed to reject and deny enrollments over the slightest issues like we just discussed. And it becomes a heavy burden for any employee to have to constantly relay these decisions to the providers. It's much different now than from a decade ago, when the payers used to beg for providers to join their networks and have the provider reps to help them achieve their active statuses. Now it's a true battle to get the payers to let you in their doors. But if you have a dedicated, strong-minded, knowledgeable individual or team that's driven by integrity, working towards the right goal, then it is definitely an achievable task. Just a much more difficult one than ever before, and becoming increasingly more difficult with every passing day.
Oh my gosh, I know. And that's why we had so many registrations for this webinar. So to be
Absolutely.
frank, all of those are some considerable challenges. So before we throw you all into a fit of depression, let's just talk about what the whole goal of this session is. And that's to help minimize lost revenue and all those administrative headaches by providing you with some practical step-by-step approaches to effective credentialing, right? So that's what we're going to do here for the rest of our session. So let's talk a little bit about why credentialing matters. And credentialing is not a trivial task, right? It's a mission critical administrative task that's required by law. It's it has a direct, very immediate impact on whether or not your practice gets paid for the services that you're rendering. So there's a summary here, and I know you've seen this before. Tanil, do you want to just comment a little bit on sort of the stated reason why there's credentialing, and then maybe the real reason why there's credentialing?
Well, sure. I mean, just in summary, the the requirement, right, is the legal regulatory compliance. You have to be credentialed. The insurances require that for reimbursement purposes. But we also know that there's reasons behind it, right? You have to be credentialed, you have to be licensed appropriately to be able to provide the services that you state that you're truly going to, provide to the community and to the patients. So there is multiple layers in regards to why it has to happen, but then the insurances with all of their regulations truly try to make it difficult for it to happen. But if you have all of your ducks in a row, all of your T's crossed and I's dotted, it truly is a identified process that is needed within the healthcare system to make sure that the providers are well equipped for what they're supposed to be doing in regards to being able to be reimbursed at the end of the day for those services they're providing.
Okay, well, that might be a good segue into this next slide here, which is about the difference between credentialing, enrollment, and privileging, right? So they're all three different but interrelated processes. But I hear these terms, used back and forth almost interchangeably. So I don't know. Do you want to give us a sort of your version of, what's the definition of each one of these things and what's the difference and what is likely this audience's most in the area that they're going to be most interested in?
Sure. So that's a great question because we do have providers that interchange these terms. We have payers that interchange these terms. We have internal staff members, external staff members. Everyone's using these three terms interchangeably. And they are interrelated, but they are definitely very much different as well. So if you're talking about credentialing, that is just focusing, as the slide states, the general qualifications and background information regarding that specific provider. Then you move into the provider enrollment area, which is my level of expertise. And that's where you're trying to enroll those providers with each of the insurance networks and have established that payer relationship. Then you have the privileging, the hospital privileging, where you are requesting for a provider to be privileged at a local facility. And that's a whole third, separate process in itself. And like I said, all of these are interchangeably used. However, they are very distinct terms that everyone needs to know exactly which one they are requiring. And most providers, especially for their hospital-based providers, they're going to be requiring all three. But just kind of depends on your audience, which terms you're using, and it has to have a lot of education behind it once you start, doing onboarding conversations with clients in regards to their true needs.
Okay, so let me see if I pass the test here. So credentialing is about verifying who a provider is and if they're qualified.
Yes.
Okay. Enrollment is about getting them paid, right? And
Yes.
enrolled in the network. And then privileging is more about what they can do or what they're allowed to do when they're at a facility. Did I get that?
That's right.
All right, good.
100%, James.
All right. You're wearing off on me now. All right. So I think this slide is meant to be sort of a big picture look at the entire credentialing process, which is, there's some structured steps. But I think this is a macro model that actually most of the folks that are on this webinar probably are more interested in the enrollment part of this. So maybe what I'll do is I'll skip past this slide to give us more time to talk about the other stuff. And then we have another model that we'll show you here in just a second. But I think what this slide is trying to do is outline categories of documentation that are typically required to credential healthcare providers. And there's a broad range of documents here. I mean, you've got personal identification and licenses and all that. And I think the main takeaway here is that credentialing demands a lot of complete up-to-date information for providers, and collecting and maintaining those accurately is pretty essential to having a smooth credentialing process. Do you want to, what types of things have you seen when it comes to issues around provider documentation? May, do you want to give us a little color on this guy?
Yes. Oh gosh. As you can imagine, James, I've seen it all. But when it comes to documentation, you must have it all. Everything listed here, if it exists, it needs to be shared with the identified individual responsible for your credentialing, provider enrollments, and privileges. From a provider enrollment standpoint, every payer requires a bit of a mix for which documents they wish to see. Some want the medical license, wallet card. Others are okay with the online verification printout. It is a best practice to ensure that there is a complete and maintained record of all documents at all times. There will often be payer requests needing an updated document to be put on file, and the last thing anyone wants to do is bother a physician to have to obtain this. If it isn't already on file, especially when the payers may only give you a 24-hour window to provide it. There should be a streamlined process in place to track expirable documentation, also to ensure that the provider's file is always in a current state for immediate use. So even though they take 180 days to process your application, they might give you a 24-hour window to give them an updated COI if it has expired or going to be expiring. So those are things you definitely have to keep and track. But literally everything listed here, if it exists, your identified specialist needs it.
Incredible. All right, so let's get our model a little bit closer to what I think this audience is going to be dealing with on a regular basis. So this slide summarizes the three most common approaches to provider credentialing and payer enrollment and how they impact both speed and complexity of onboarding. I think first here, unless you want to just go through this list rather than me talk through the list, do you want to talk about these three different models and where you find most, yeah, I want to serve the audience that we're talking to here. So let's talk mainly about the stuff that mostly they would be doing if they were doing it on their own, or if they're going to outsource it and get help from someone else, what that would look like.
Sure. So, I mean, like we've discussed, these three are the most common approaches to credentialing and pay enrollments, but are all very unique depending on the practice's needs. And my expertise is certainly the direct provider enrollment. So I'll be speaking, regarding that aspect of it. But the credentialing standard, I mean, typically, that is an outsourced kind of event for providers. The delegated credentialing, that's only if they're within a large practice setting. So typically, if you have over 100 providers and they are linked in with an actual PHO, then they can go through that process. And then the direct provider enrollment, where the actual provider, the practice, smaller than 100 providers within the practice, are individually contracted with each of those payers. So that's the one that we'll definitely be diving into today.
Okay. And so I think the takeaway here is that delegated credentialing and direct provider enrollment, they can accelerate things over leaving it to the payers to do it.
Correct.
It requires very good accuracy and very good compliance. And so whatever method you end up using, it's pretty much always the practice's responsibility to maintain accurate info. Since errors and omissions end up impacting your, participation, payment, and compliance, right?
Right.
All right, so here's our simpler model of credentialing here. And so I think this is what most everybody on this call is going to be doing. So it's got, direct provider enrollment as the process here, as experienced by a practice doing it themselves. And in this model, you're responsible for everything and you're orchestrating all the steps. That means whether you're managing the work in-house or you're even getting some help from an outsourced party. But do you want to talk through the different stages here and then maybe talk through, where the challenges tend to be?
Absolutely. Yes. So when you see the direct provider enrollment process in a condensed 7-step process here, it seems fairly simple, but just to note that each step has approximately 20 to 30 sub-steps, James. It's really where having a dedicated specialist is, going to help and, really take you across that finish line. But without having any expertise, that it can still happen. It just may cause some issues. But if we look at these process steps here, and let me bring this up a little larger, it definitely shows, preparing the credentialing information. So that's onboarding the provider, gathering all of the provider's details, documents, any information related to that provider, all of those details that we had on the slide just a couple of slides back. Then you're going to be completing the credentialing onboarding, which is a continuation of all of the gathering of information, right? So all details related to the practice, all details related to the provider, you need it all. Then you're going to begin preparing your submission. So you're going to be reaching out to the payers, finding out what exactly is needed, performing a discovery call, asking them if the provider's already in network, if this is a brand new startup practice, what is required for the practice level contract, all of those details. And you're also going to want to ask them what the ETA is for turnaround processing timeframes. If they backdate their effective dates, what documentation is required when you get ready to do that submission. Then you're going to actually do the pay enrollment and or the hospital privileging submission, depending on which one you're performing. So you're going to complete the application that they've provided or the form or the required letter of intent, whatever the payer has informed you that is needed, and you're going to submit it to the payer. Now you're going to move to step number 5, which is that payer enrollment follow-up. And this is key. You're going to want to wait at least 2 weeks from your initial submission before you contact the payer to ask them if the application was received. Because if you call a little too soon, they can falsely inform you that the application was never received. You will then want to be prompted to resubmit so that you can get it on file. However, if they then have two applications side by side, I have seen payers reject because they weren't sure which application to process, even though they were identical. So definitely wait a couple of weeks before you do that initial follow-up, and then continue on a 2-week basis follow-up going forward until the approval is received. The last thing you want to do is wait for 30 to 60 days to go by, contact the payer to find out where you're at in the processing timeframe, and they tell you that an incomplete form was used because they changed a form a week after you made your initial submission. They do that. So you definitely want to do continuous follow-up, making sure that you're tracking representatives' names, reference ID numbers, the whole 9 yards, so that you have a bit of a leg to stand on when you have to file an appeal with these payers that tend to drop off applications or misplace applications, et cetera, because you're fighting for an effective date for this plan in this contract. And the more documentation you have, the better off you're going to be able to do to, succeed in those appeals. And then your enrollment status communication, that's going to be once you actually receive your approval, you're going to then provide that, broadcast that across, obviously have a small victory celebration, provide that to your front desk staff and administration so that they're able to schedule patients with that payer. And then you're going to continue with ongoing routine maintenance, which is just making sure that these payers still have your updated licenses, your CAQH reattestations are performed, any revalidations that are coming in the door, you're going to want to be able to perform those timely, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that seems like a real simple process, but there is a lot involved in there.
One of your team told me that credentialing is like this blend of persistence and organization because of the way payers interact with you. It's can be frustrating. On the ongoing maintenance, how frequently is someone going to have to go through this process again after initial credentialing?
Well, it just depends. So provider directories definitely want updates every 90 days. So that's part of that ongoing routine maintenance. Your CAQH account needs to be reattested every 120 days, although we recommend every 90, once a quarter. But then the revalidation requests, they are typically between 3 and 5 years, depending on the payer themselves. So you have a bit of a leeway there. However, if you have a license that renews before your revalidation is up, that has to be communicated to those payers through that maintenance work as well.
Gotcha. All right. Well, so let's keep hustling here. I'm worried that we might not have enough time for Q&A. So I think what this slide is doing is summarizing some of the more important strategies that end up helping practices run a smooth and efficient and compliant credentialing process. You want to cherry pick any of these and highlight any of them for the audience?
Okay, sure. Looks like I would start with the first one, obviously. Centralized documentation housing is a must. It is the only efficient way to maintain and manage documents as well as enrollment records for the providers. So I can't recommend this enough. Beginning the process early, I'm trying not to go straight down the list, but I can't stress the importance of this enough either. As we've discussed the lengthy enrollment timeframes, one of the best ways to get enrolled timely is to start it early. There are some payers that will not let you begin the process more than 30 to 60 days in advance, such as Medicare. However, it is true that the early bird gets the worm. So the earlier you can get your application in the door of the payer, the sooner they will get it, they'll be able to get to you in the stack to be able to process it, because they truly do work the applications in the order in which they are received. So imagine if there's 500 providers ahead of you in line, just look at how long the processing time frame could be for that, right? Now, avoiding common errors, I would definitely call that one out by ensuring the individual that's completing the application truly is specialized in their field and understands the differences between, let's say, a type 1 or a type 2 NPI number, that they have a high level of built-in compliance to ensure that they don't accidentally fill in the box that says county with United States of America because they thought it said country. I've seen this before, and it's been a reason for a rejection. So even the simplest errors or mistakes can create delays. Monitoring progress and follow-up, definitely. Making sure to notate every submission method, when and how it was sent, obtain call reference numbers like we mentioned, for every call that is made to the payers for all of the needed outreaches. Consistently following up is a true requirement to prevent any unexpected kickbacks. So yeah, I think those would be the top ones.
All right, great. Well, let's keep moving on here so we can get through all the content. So I want to talk a little bit about automation here. And so what this slide is trying to do is highlight some of the technology-driven solutions that help transform the credentialings from a sort of a manual error-prone process to something that's more efficient and compliant process. So again, don't have to go through the whole list, but maybe pull out a couple of these things that you think are the most I don't know, either beneficial or strategically the place that practices should start.
hmm if financially able, the credentialing software platforms are the way to go. I mean, they have the end-to-end automation, like it mentions here, definitely in the best interest for a practice. Um, because they have a great deal of automation processes already built inside that software, they can drastically reduce the employee's hours spent on credentialing and provide enrollments. So I've seen both sides, right? Where practices have utilized spreadsheets to be able to track their information, and then ones that are utilizing the software platforms, and it's hands down night and day difference. Can you effectively credential and track your provider enrollments through Excel spreadsheets? Of course. But is it as efficient and easy to not have to worry about misses or issues through a credentialing platform? Hands down. So definitely recommend, I'm sorry if you guys can hear my dog in the background, but I definitely recommend the credentialing software platforms for the practice if it makes financial sense. And then the CAQH database integration, it's a requirement. It's a must. You have to have that up and running. You have to have a CAQH profile for every provider, and it has to be updated routinely. Like I said, reattested every 120 days. So that all of the payers that are utilizing CAQH are able to pull that information accurately, and it reflects accurately. If there's any discrepancies there, they're going to kick that enrollment out as well. So I know we're going to talk more about CAQH here soon, James, but those would be the ones I would highlight.
Well, very good. So you're a strong advocate of using technology, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's transition to avoiding delays here. So, and what this slide is trying to do is bring together some of the core strategies that help practices proactively avoid, some of the common credentialing delays. And I think we've talked about quite a bit of this already, but I don't know if there's any items on here that you'd like to call out as far as, guidance on avoiding credentialing delays.
I mean, honestly, I do believe we've touched on the majority of these, but my top three that I would recommend would be start early, be thorough with your outreach to the payers and with the application completions, and follow up routinely. Can't stress that enough.
All stuff we've talked about so far. So now let's talk about re-credentialing. So that's this essential, periodic process of re-verifying and updating a provider's credentials to make sure that the compliance is ongoing. So, but unlike initial credentialing, which happens once, re-credentialing takes place, I don't know, every 2 or 3 years or something like that. So, it does repeat a lot of the processes. Help us by contrasting a little different, between what's involved in re-credentialing versus the initial credentialing.
Yes, so it is just a re-verification process, making sure that all of the credentials that are on file for that provider are still valid for them. Ensuring that all license information is up to date and valid, obviously most important, but then also all practice details. They want to make sure that all of the communication efforts that will be coming through from the payer's end are valid as well. So it is a start to finish re-validation, re-credentialing process that the payers do require every 2 to 3. Some payers even extend it out 5 years, which is quite nice. But it is a process that they typically will process your enrollment or your revalidation request much more quickly because they don't have to go start to finish and comb through every little detail. They've already done that through the initial. So it's just a re-verification process, but it is a process that sometimes payers do tend to take some delayed times to perform. So want to definitely call out, the fact that as soon as you receive a revalidation or recredentialing request, to perform it as quickly as possible. If they're sending you a notice that it's upcoming and it's 3 months out or 60 days out, which is the typical norm, jump right in. Make sure it happens right then and there. Don't wait until, oh, well, I have a couple of months until the termination date is, bolded on the letter. Don't wait till then because a lot of these payers, especially the state Medicaids, will send out those 60-day notices, but then will take 6 months to process the revalidation request. And not to scare everybody, but what happens is if you wait until that 60-day notice is received to submit your request, even though you've submitted it timely and it is in process prior to the termination date, if it is not received and approved prior to that termination date, they can stop payments to the individuals. So you definitely don't want to run into that. Just giving you a heads up that we have seen that from some state Medicaids, and it's just unreal, honestly. So don't rely on them to send the communication to you either. That's the other big mistake that often happens is because you're waiting for them to communicate this to you, but sometimes the address that was on file from a previous specialist or a previous company that was handling this for you has it going to a different location than where you would have needed it to be received. Or once again, I hate to say this, but payer tactics do come into play here. And sometimes they will, not send the communication, even though they say that they do. And you are none the wiser. And then they will stop payments. And now you have to start from scratch trying to do a re-enrollment. So the best key advice here is once you get your initial enrollment letter and it has your effective date, to contact them if it doesn't specify in that letter how long your enrollment is good for, which, like we said, it varies from payer to payer, is to contact them and ask them when the revalidation will be due, and then track that in a credentialing platform database would be preferred, or on an Excel spreadsheet if you aren't able to do the automation processes, and then make sure that you have, the follow-up in place prior to that termination date that's upcoming. Can't express that enough either, James.
Okay, two questions for you on this. First, for government contracts, how often should someone, just on average, have
Yep.
to recredential?
Government is typically the closer to the 5-year range. It depends on their provider specialty, though. So a lot of the MDs are the 5-year range. A lot of the NPs are the 3-year range. It kind of just depends state to state as well, though.
Okay, second, and I know this differs across every state, but I'll just ask you anyway. If you
Yes.
have to estimate about how long it takes for
Mhm.
government contracts to handle the recredentialing on their side once you've given them everything, what would you guess?
I'm going to go with the same processing time frame as the initials, which is that 60 to 90-day time frame, depending on the state, but we have seen some that are the 6 months or longer.
Okay, is it look worse for commercial payers or better?
It's worse. Everything's worse with the commercial payers, just the same with the initials, lengthier time frames. So for revalidations, it's a lengthier time frame for that as well.
Okay, so start early is the name of the game here. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, so this slide is kind of spotlighting the more common pitfalls that practices face during credentialing. I think we've mentioned quite a few of these already throughout the session, but any of these you want to, highlight or pick out and accentuate?
Definitely. I mean, just doing everything that you possibly can to ensure that you do not miss that renewal deadline is is key here, right? So like I said, the biggest mistake I've seen are the providers relying on the payers to inform them of the need, but yet they never receive the notices. So not timely enough to allow for the payers processing timeframes either. So if you get a notice and it's 60 days out from your termination date, however, they take 6 months to process it, that's a real problem. So definitely manually tracking for that potential gap is definitely advisable here.
Well, yeah, we're back to paying telehealth claims now that the government's working again. But
Right.
let's talk about multi-state credentialing for a second here, because that can get pretty varied. You want to just talk a little bit about that for folks that are trying to do telehealth in multiple states?
Yes, so the multiple states are just that, right? There are very few payers that I wish everyone knew, right? So this is the opportunity to share. There are very, very, very few payers that will allow you to enroll with the payer level across multiple states. So if you're wanting to be enrolled within multiple states, you are going through Blue Cross Blue Shield in California. You're going through Blue Cross Blue Shield in Arizona. You're going through Blue Cross Blue Shield in an additional state, so forth and so on. They have state-specific requirements for each of the payer levels that do not let you span across multiple states other than for a very, very select few handful of payers, such as TRICARE.
Okay. So important is remember, you're going to have to multiply your work times the number of states you're operating in, right?
That is right. Yes.
Okay, well, I want to accelerate a little bit here. So we're pulling this all together into some sort of actionable strategies. So we've talked about pretty much everything on this list. So if
Yep.
there's any one of these items that you want to highlight here, this would be a good chance to do that.
Start early. The start early, start early, start
Our
early.
session today is start early. Okay. Well, let's keep ourselves on time. And you mentioned this slide that you knew it was coming. So let's
Yes.
talk about CAQH. So give us the Tenille Mail experts, summary of CAQH.
Sure. So it's an organization that is truly becoming the primary hub for provider data for the commercial payers. A lot of these commercial payers, I wish all of them, James, but unfortunately it's not all, but a lot of them are utilizing the data within the CAQH profile. So it requires you to just simply submit the CAQH ID to the payer. They are able to extract all of the data that's in that CAQH profile to then perform the enrollment on your behalf. It's a beautiful process. Now, why all payers aren't set up like that, I don't know, but that's my dream and that's my goal. At some point they will be, but definitely is a requirement for any kind of updates to be maintained. Like I said, reattestations are required every 120 days. It is advisable to do these once a quarter, so recommended to do them every 90 days instead. But you obviously should not be waiting until that 120-day range if you have any kind of updates that needs to be made, such as COIs that have been updated, your license information that needs updated, or your practice details. If you have a new phone number at your establishment, that needs to be updated at CAQH and then reattested so that these payers have all of that accurate information at their fingertips at all times.
All right. Well, hopefully someday it will become universal, but it's a big benefit up to this point.
Yes.
Okay. Again, this might be a repeat of what you just said, but let's just see. Is there anything on here that you didn't already cover? Well, so let me ask you a question. We'll deviate a little bit.
Okay.
If you're using software, will this
Yes.
automatically get updated typically if you're using software to help you with credentialing? Or you have to
Unfortunately,
log into their platform and then do the update there?
yep. Unfortunately, there isn't any interfaces with CAQH yet, but once again, hopes and dreams. So you do have to manually log into the profiles, provider by provider, make those updates as needed, because there is no way to do that. You can do automation reminders for yourself. Lots of systems have where you enter what date you did the initial attestation of the account or the initial creation of the account, and it will auto calculate the 120 days, or you can have it give you the reminder at the 90-day mark. Or like I said, if you have any changes that need to happen prior to that, you got to make sure it gets done.
Okay, so you got to maintain it outside and then keep going and log into this to do the update.
That's
So,
right.
and since we had access to you on this session, I thought I would just take a moment and draw on your decades of experience here
Sure.
to let you share any of your real world, experiences and tips. We can also field any questions maybe that the audience has at this point. We tried our best to leave a little bit of time here for the end. But I do have one early question here, and that is, I don't recognize the name, but it says, we've been struggling with a payer for over 5 months. Is there any way to force this payer to respond more quickly?
Great question. Excellent question. So a lot of times our hands are tied, right? Because There are no provider reps anymore. There aren't any direct contacts at the payer levels that you can typically call them, directly and get an answer, and they can move you up the stack. You're at the mercy of the payer. You're contacting the payer, and you get to talk to representative whomever today. You call back in 30 minutes and it's a different representative. And then you call back tomorrow and it's a third representative, and so forth and so on. In 5 months, that it doesn't surprise me that we are in that kind of time frame right now. Sometimes, and I use this recommendation as often as needed, but also want to caution everybody in regards to this. But sometimes if the provider themselves call the payer and say, I am Dr. So-and-so, I need to know what's going on with my enrollment, it sometimes will expedite the process. Sometimes the payer will take that to heart and realize that there's a true person behind this application, and they need to do what they have been hired to do, which is process it. So occasionally we will recommend for the providers to get involved. It's not something that the providers have time to do. But at the same time, if you have a real difficult payer that is dragging their feet, the whole 9 yards, you can definitely request to have the provider get on the phone. And sometimes it does make a difference.
Okay. I got a couple others here, but we had one that just came in that is a really good one.
Oh, good.
So says, what do you do when an IPA says that we're at the mercy of the health plan? Right? Like they're hiding behind the health plan, right? And so she's asking, don't health plans have regulations too that they have to comply with here?
Absolutely. There's compliance across the board, right? We're not the only ones that have to be compliant with everything that we're doing. It has to be from the insurance payer side as well. But once again, it is often the struggle. We are at the mercy, but they do have to follow regulations. They do have to ensure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. Sometimes this is also when you can get those providers involved and make those calls, make those files to the state complaint offices. That has occurred, and it has made movements. It has caused, payers to have to hire additional staffing because processing timeframes were so immensely delayed. Backdating effective dates were not entertained. The whole 9 yards, which was causing a tremendous revenue loss for practitioners. So definitely, there are laws and regulations that are in place that you can push to have these payers doing what they're supposed to do. But a lot of times they are within their standards and within their limitations where they are allowed to drag their feet for 6+ months for the processing time frame and not give you an effective date until after it's formally processed and approved.
Unbelievable, with horrible ramifications, of course,
Yes.
which actually ties into kind of this question here, which is an interesting one. It's what safeguards can we put in place so that uncredentialed providers don't see patients with insurance they're not credentialed for?
So definitely schedule blocking, informing the front desk office staff so that they are well aware of which payers each of the providers are participating with when they are scheduling patient appointments is key, because that's the last thing you want to do is to have a patient being registered at the front desk, being seen by the provider, and then not get paid for the service afterwards. And the patient doesn't want that either, right? They want to be seen, but they also know that their providers need to be paid for their services. So definitely some schedule blocking to make sure of that, but communication to the front desk staff is key so that they are aware of who is in network, who is out of network, who you're in process to become in network, have grids for them to reference. If they have access to credentialing database systems, then they can just automatically check on a daily basis who is in, who is not. Definitely open communication regarding whomever is performing the enrollment process and who is scheduling those patients has to happen.
Yeah, I've seen groups so excited to see patients because they're new and a startup and trying to fill their panel that they start seeing patients they're not credentialed for, and that ends badly, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah. All right, here's one. We're a 3-provider practice. Does it make sense for us to explore getting software, or is the spreadsheet better for someone like us? To track credentialing, I assume, is what they mean.
Yeah. Honestly, if you have less than 10 providers, depending on your financial well-being, I would love to see you have a credentialing software platform. I would love that for you because of all the features that it has. But I also know there is a tremendous cost that comes with credentialing database platforms. So for a three provider practice, honestly, I would recommend starting out with the spreadsheets, starting with Excel, doing those kinds of tracking. I know one spreadsheet turns into 20 easily, but it is doable. It is very, very much doable, and it is a cost saver. But if you can get whoever is making the financial decisions to award the thought of having a credentialing database system because of the cost, I would definitely push for that.
All right, definitely an opinion. All right, here's a hard one. What should we do if a provider has a sanction, a malpractice claim, or a disciplinary action in their history?
It has to be disclosed. Has to be disclosed. It needs to be in CAQH. It has to be disclosed to the payers. If it's within the last 10 years, right? So they're doing a 10-year look back in regards to those things. And if it's nothing, it's nothing. But if you don't disclose it, they're going to find out when they do their deep dive and you've not disclosed it, it can be a red flag. It can cause a rejection, a denial, a disallowance with that payer. The last thing you want is red flagged with an insurance, especially one of the big dogs. So definitely disclose. You have to include that information.
Okay, no easy outs.
Right.
All right, so here's one. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but you know, is there a best way to keep CAQH up to date? Or is there's kind of only one way, right?
It's just the one and only, unfortunately. Yes, just tracking that 120-day requirement, making sure that you maintain those provider logins. You are allowed to log in on the provider's behalf. A provider does not have to do that themselves. So you can attest or reattest on their behalf. So that's definitely, a recommended best practice because the providers do not have the time to do this, especially every 120 days, or if you move it up to the 90-day mark, right? So you definitely want to be able to log in there, but having true logins is key. But once you have the set login, that's something that typically doesn't require to be changed, unlike Paycos, which is every 60 days they want a new updated password. CAQH thankfully has not gone down that path yet. So once you share your login details, someone can easily do that on your behalf if you allow them to do so.
Okay, an interesting question related to CMA here. It looks like Allison's helping us out on this one. So maybe if you can look in the chat, you'll see a little dialogue there about Medi-Cal and yeah, elevating when. Let me look here quick here. Let's let them finish that conversation, actually. So I got one more question, and I think we have to wrap up here. We're going to run out of time here. So where is this at? I think we already talked about this a little bit, but is there any shortcut for credentialing the same payer across multiple states?
Same payer across multiple states, shortcuts, no. Unfortunately, it's per state basis, per payer basis. So the only expediting capabilities that you have are going to be if your provider is already in the network. So if you're a practice that is bringing on a new practitioner that isn't brand new, that has already worked at another healthcare system, that has already worked at another practice, and now they're joining your practice, they're going to be in those payer systems. So that is going to help you tremendously. It's still going to probably require the same kind of application, but once the payer gets the application, they can sometimes run through the processing of that application a little quicker because they were already in the system under a different practice. Now we're just adding your practice for them. So that's
Well,
really the only way to get it expedited.
speeds up their side, not your side.
Right.
So,
Yep.
all right, well, that's good. That's like all we have time for in the questions. So let's wrap up and just kind of reinforce the most important stuff here. First, credentialing isn't just an administrative hurdle. It's literally the backbone of both practice compliance and steady revenue flow. Delays or mistakes don't just slow things down. They literally translate directly into lost income and increased risk. And that's why centralizing your credentialing process, using automation when you can, and making CAQH the cornerstone of your data management is really effective and essentially required. And then it's equally important to have, a proactive, disciplined approach, right? And as Tennille said, start early, keep good records, use checklists, and then audit all the time. And then lastly, treating credentialing as an ongoing team-wide discipline, not just a one-time event. You can safeguard your revenue, you can maintain your compliance, and focus more energy on delivering care and growing the practice. We appreciate everyone's engagement throughout here today. Tennille, why don't you give us some parting guidance and sage advice on credentialing before we wrap up?
Well, guys, James, as you know, once you hand over the mic, I could talk on and on and on because outside of my three children, credentialing is my favorite topic to discuss. So, I mean, I truly love it. Not everyone does, but it isn't as scary as it sounds. But just make sure that when you're dealing with these payers, that you have a broad set of shoulders because it is a heavy load that you've got to carry when you're trying to work through all the regulations.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us. Let me just show this last piece. If any of you would like some help in this area or for revenue cycle, there is a way that San Bernardino Medical Society has provided for you to get some help for free. I know how challenging it is to start down this road alone. So if you'd like some help, and we can do a revenue cycle assessment for you. And so if you'd like some help in that area, we can do an assessment for you. And as SBCMS, they cover it for you. So if you'd like that, then all you got to do is snap this QR code or use one of the URLs below. We'll help you out. There's no charge for it. It's just our way of supporting SBCMS. So wonderful experience being with you all today. We appreciate these opportunities to be able to share our knowledge. And of course, we're super grateful for Tennille who joined us today. So thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next educational session.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Allison.
everyone. Thank you so much, James and Tennille. You guys are absolutely amazing. That was so valuable, and we look forward to seeing you and UnisLink at our next session that you will be presenting for us. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.